President Trump, with the Statue of Liberty as a backdrop. Today, serving as honorary chairman for the President's Cup golf tournament. His predecessors were at the course Thursday, but today wound up on Mr. Trump's Twitter feed, criticized for how they handled North Korea's nuclear threat. Being nice to Rocket Man hasn't worked in 25 years. Why would it work now? Clinton failed, Bush failed, and Obama failed. I won't fail. Trump also appeared to undermine a new diplomatic channel announced just yesterday by the Secretary of State. I told Rex Tillerson he's wasting his time trying to negotiate with little Rocket Man. Save your energy, Rex. We'll do what has to be done. Is the president suggesting military action or taunting Kim Jong-un?
Well, there are conflicting messages from the Trump administration on North Korea, questioning the results of any diplomatic negotiations with Kim Jong-un's regime. You know, this happened just one day after Secretary of State Rex Tillerson left that door open, it seems. He was in Beijing, you can see there, when they announced that the U.S. had a direct line of communication with Pyongyang. Well, today, the president tweeted this, quote, "Being nice to Rocket Man hasn't worked in 25 years. Why would it work now? Clinton failed, Bush failed, and Obama failed. I won't fail." That after the president earlier this morning tweeted this, "I told Rex Tillerson, our wonderful Secretary of State, that he is wasting his time trying to negotiate with little Rocket Man. Save your energy, Rex. We'll do what has to be done. We'll do what has to be done." Former U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations John Bolton echoed the president earlier when he was on America's News headquarters here in the Fox News Channel.
I think the president's absolutely right. It confounds me to think that the State Department is still trying to talk to North Korea. If that's what Secretary Tillerson meant, it is a complete waste of time. It's a waste of oxygen.
Oh, let's bring in Alan Smith now, politics reporter for the Business Insider. Alan, welcome. Is the president undermining the Secretary of State, do you think, or is this a strategy to try to put more pressure on Kim Jong-un and Beijing?
So, I mean, well, it's one of the two things right there. So either the administration's really not on the same page in terms of what messages that they're projecting, or they're doing this intentionally. So if this is happening intentionally, we know that the North Korean diplomats are already quite confused. It's been reported that North Korean diplomats have reached out to Republican consultants in D.C., to see why is it that the cabinet officials and Trump, their messaging is not on the same page. Why is that? So we know that Trump, he, as was reported by Axios earlier today, he wanted his trade representative Lighthizer to, tell the South Koreans that, look, this guy's crazy. He could pull out of the South Korean trade deal at any moment. So Trump does like to project, sort of that madman theory on foreign policy. So it seems likely that he does enjoy confusing the North Koreans to an extent.
That so-called madman theory, I mean, it kind of worked for President Nixon when it came to China, obviously. And it wouldn't be a good thing to confuse the North Koreans because they would take a deep breath and stop and say, well, wait a minute, what are we doing? I mean, this could really be dangerous by popping off all these missiles and with all these threats.
Absolutely, and that would appear to be the goal by the Trump administration. If they're going along this path of, trying to implement the madman theory here in North Korea, they think that, look, if we can sort of out-crazy Kim Jong-un a little bit, maybe he's going to take some steps back and think, all right, wait a minute, maybe I don't have as much leeway to play around with here as I previously did.
Would that get them to the table potentially, do you think?
I think it could potentially get them to the table. I mean, Trump has said very recently that diplomacy is not something that's off the table. He was asked during the UN week, they said, look, is diplomacy an option here? And he said, something along the lines of, we'll see, why not?
He wants that he'd be honored to meet Kim Jong-un.
Yeah, absolutely. He said that before. He's even entertained the idea of Kim Jong-un coming to the White House. So, I mean, the tweets, if you take them by themselves, they look, a little maybe concerning. But if you look at the entire message, Trump has sort of been all over the place on what he wants to do with North Korea.
But what you're saying is, having covered the UN the other week, that there is a different tone between the tweets and between some of his speeches and some of what he says. Even though he had a very blunt speech at the United Nations, off the cuff, it's a different tone, you think?
Absolutely. I mean, and it's not only for North Korea. There are many subjects where it's like this, where Trump takes a much stronger, a more brash, even a more bombastic tone on Twitter. But when asked, face to face, he seems to be taking, somewhat of a more pragmatic stance. I mean, especially when he was asked about North Korea, if diplomacy is still an option. I mean, he made it seem as if it was on the table. And his cabinet secretaries have all talked up diplomacy whenever asked.
But he does have a point in the latest tweet later this afternoon when he said being nice to Rocket Man hasn't worked in 25 years. Why would it work now? Clinton failed, Bush failed, Obama failed. I won't fail. Look, 1994, the Oil for Food program under the Clinton administration didn't work. North Korea completely lied. You've got the six-party talks that basically failed, and President George W. Bush took North Korea off the terrorist list. I mean, that's an olive branch to them, and they gave us the baseball bat instead. I mean, President George W. Bush tried, and it still didn't work.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that we still are having this conversation about North Korea today means that all of the previous administrations, since the Korean War, really have not been able to make any progress on this front.
So what will it take, do you think?
Well, I think the Trump administration is trying something much different than prior administrations by trying to, out-provoke North Korea. We've seen previously that more docile approaches haven't worked as effectively. So, maybe this is what gets him to the table. But I will say this. President Bush was at a private dinner last week, and he was asked, will reunification of the Korean Peninsula happen in your lifetime? And he said no, he did not think so. And reunification of the peninsula is essentially what I personally think would need to happen in order for North Korea to become a more open society.
Well, North Korea wants to reunify the peninsula under their control.
Yes.
And kick us 28,000 troops out and have us stop the joint military exercises. I mean, is some of this on the table? Earlier, John Bolton, when I interviewed him today, also said this about the talks and about some of the North Korean aims. Let's listen.
My prediction would be if at any point North Korea suddenly announces they want to sit down to talks, it means they're this close to getting a deliverable nuclear weapons capability, and they want to make absolutely sure they get across the finish line while we're playing the sucker.
President Trump is suggesting that the U.S. should not try to negotiate with North Korea. The president tweeted this morning, quote, I told Rex Tillerson, our wonderful Secretary of State, that he is wasting his time trying to negotiate with little Rocket Man. Save your energy, Rex. We'll do what has to be done. Those tweets came after Tillerson said the U.S. was in direct talks with the North. The State Department later walked that comment back by saying the North has not shown any indication of interest in talks regarding denuclearization. For more on this, we turn to Isaac Stonefish. He is a senior fellow at the Asia Society Center on U.S.-China Relations. Isaac, welcome.
Thank you.
So the president says that negotiating with North Korea is a waste of time, just a day after Rex Tillerson said more or less the opposite. What kind of message does that send to North Korea?
It sends a very confusing message both to North Korea and to the American people who want to start having some faith in the American government's ability to make some changes, get things done with North Korea. And yet when Secretary of State says one thing, President says another thing, it's really hard to believe that they're going to be able to get this done.
So South Korea and China want a diplomatic solution. How likely are they going to be receiving the president's remark? I mean, you said yourself, it's a confusing thing. And if you're actually someone that is trying to advance some kind of dialogue, where does that leave you?
I think the message that Tillerson is privately giving to Xi Jinping and the Chinese leadership is probably somewhat different from what he's saying publicly, and that's totally understandable. That's part of the way diplomacy works. But I think on the public side, Chinese and South Korean people and the leaders are probably just confused by this strategy. It's really hard to know with so many things in the Trump administration, this included, is this a calculated misinformation strategy or is this just incompetence?
I mean, is there any strategic benefit, though, Isaac, to this kind of approach where you have good cop, bad cop? seemingly, anyway.
I think one could argue that there is a strategic benefit to doing this if this is very carefully planned and calculated. Otherwise, we sort of feel like a 1980s spy movie with sort of two blundering officials doing one thing, saying another, and you just really hope there's some thinking and strategy behind
There
this.
could be, though, I guess is the point. I mean, we don't know, to be fair, what exactly is being said in the private communications, right, with North Korea.
And I think that's an issue of how much trust and belief we have right now in our government's ability to negotiate with North Korea. If we give them the benefit of the doubt, then I think we can assume that there's a sophisticated messaging going on behind the scenes. And if we don't, then it kind of leaves us where we've been.
So let me ask you, we saw China agree to enforce UN sanctions against Pyongyang, which includes restricting oil exports and closing North Korean companies. Do you think that's going to be effective?
I don't really think that further isolating North Korea is going to help bring it to the table. I mean, I think we've seen North Korea in the 1990s suffer a devastating famine and not necessarily be more willing to negotiate. I mean, I think the confusing thing about what Trump and Tillerson are saying is that if we're saying we're not going to negotiate with them, then what's the path out? What's the solution? If there's no talks, then are you closing off the idea of a non-military solution? And that, to me, is quite scary.